Shadows beneath the lake. It was a cold autumn evening in Millhaven, a small town nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The town had always been quiet, a place where everyone knew everyone else. But there was one place that stood out, a lake, shrouded in mystery and dread. Locals called it Shadows Lake, a name born out of the eerie shapes that seemed to move beneath its surface during the dead of night. Legend had it that the lake had a soul, one that craved company. But those who ventured too close often disappeared, swallowed by its obsidian depths. Every town has its ghost stories, its urban legends. But Shadows Lake? This wasn't just a story. It was a warning. That warning didn't stop 24-year-old Emma Green from renting the old cabin by the lake. Fresh out of a bitter breakup and desperate for solitude, she thought the cabin would be the perfect place to heal. The price was suspiciously low, but she brushed it off, chalking it up to local superstition. She thought she was getting a deal. But sometimes, the things that seem too good to be true are exactly that. Emma arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the lake in hues of crimson and gold. The cabin was quaint, with creaky floorboards and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Despite its charm, there was an unsettling silence, a kind of stillness that pressed against her chest. At first, it felt like peace. But peace and isolation? They can feel eerily similar. As the days passed, Emma began to notice strange occurrences. It started small, a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision, the faint sound of whispers when she stood near the water. She dismissed it as her imagination, a trick of the mind in an unfamiliar place. But then, the whispers grew louder. One night, as Emma stood by the window, staring out at the moonlit lake, she heard it clearly, a voice. It wasn't a scream or a cry. It was a murmur, soft and pleading. And it was coming from the water. Emma froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She convinced herself it was the wind, but deep down, she knew better. The voice had been too human, too desperate. The next morning, she ventured out to the lake, hoping to prove to herself that it was nothing. The water was dark and still, its surface reflecting the gray sky above. As she crouched near the edge, a chill ran down her spine. She felt watched. Have you ever felt eyes on you, even when you're alone? It's a feeling you can't shake. A primal instinct that tells you something's there. Emma tried to shake off the unease, but that night, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't pleading. They were angry. They called her name. Over and over. Emma. Emma. Come closer. Terrified, she locked her doors and windows, but the whispers seeped through the walls, wrapping around her like a cold embrace. Sleep was impossible. By dawn, Emma was exhausted and on edge. She decided to leave. But as she packed her things, a knock came at the door. It was an old man, hunched and weathered, with eyes that seemed to see straight through her. He didn't introduce himself. Didn't even ask to come in. He just said, "You should have stayed away." Emma demanded answers, but the old man only shook his head. "The lake doesn't let go," he muttered before walking away. That night, the whispers turned into screams. They weren't just calling her name. They were crying out in pain. Begging. Cursing. Desperate, Emma grabbed a flashlight and stormed out to the lake. The air was icy, her breath visible in the pale moonlight. As she neared the water's edge, the whispers stopped. For the first time in days, there was silence. But it wasn't comforting. It was waiting. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on something half submerged in the water. Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was a hand. Pale and motionless, it reached out from the lake as if frozen in a final plea for help. Before she could react, the hand moved, gripping the edge of the shore. She stumbled back, her mind racing. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. The hand was followed by another, then a head, its features bloated and unrecognizable. The figure crawled out of the lake, water pouring from its lifeless eyes and mouth. Emma screamed, stumbling backward as more figures emerged from the water, their voices echoing in a chorus of anguish. They surrounded her, their cold, wet hands reaching for her. And then, she heard it. A voice, clearer than the rest. "Stay with us," it whispered. "Join us." Emma bolted for the cabin, slamming the door behind her. But the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. The walls seemed to tremble, the very air vibrating with their fury. She knew she couldn't stay. But where could she go? The lake wasn't just outside. It was everywhere. In a desperate bid for escape, Emma grabbed her car keys and ran. As she drove away, the whispers faded, replaced by a deafening silence. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. Her rearview mirror showed something that made her blood run cold. From the back seat, a pair of lifeless eyes stared back at her. Emma's scream echoed through the night, but by the time the locals found her car the next morning, it was empty. All that remained was a single set of wet footprints, leading back to the lake. They say Whispering Lake, or Shadows Lake, as some call it, takes what it wants. And once it has you, there's no escape. So, if you ever find yourself in Millhaven, stay away from the water. The Forgotten Asylum. Tucked away in the dense woods of Ridgeville, Vermont, stood the crumbling remains of Blackwood Asylum. Abandoned for decades, the asylum had become the stuff of local legends, a place of horror where whispers of suffering lingered in the air. No one dared to venture near it, especially after sunset. They said the spirits of the patients still roamed the halls, trapped by the horrors they endured. But 26-year-old Jake Anderson wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. Jake wasn't afraid of the dark or the tales that sent shivers down others' spines. To him, Blackwood was just another forgotten building, a perfect subject for his growing urban exploration channel. Armed with his camera, a flashlight, and a couple of friends, Rachel, the cautious one, and Eric, the thrill-seeker, Jake planned to document the asylum for his next video. The group arrived just as the last rays of sunlight bled into the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The asylum loomed before them, its broken windows resembling hollow eyes. The air was thick with decay and an unshakable sense of dread. As they stepped through the rusted gates, the world seemed to change. The chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves fell silent, replaced by a suffocating stillness. Inside, the asylum was a maze of peeling paint, graffiti, and forgotten remnants of a grim past. Rusty gurneys and broken wheelchairs littered the halls, and old medical charts lay scattered on the floor. Rachel clung to Jake's arm. "This place gives me the creeps," she whispered. Jake laughed it off, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they ventured deeper, they stumbled upon the asylum's records room. Among the dust-covered files, Jake found something chilling, a patient log dated 1936. The entries detailed cruel experiments, inhumane treatments, and the mysterious disappearance of dozens of patients. One name, in particular, caught his eye: Eleanor Grayson. She was only 18 when she was admitted for hysteria. The log ended abruptly, with no mention of her release or death. But scribbled in the margins were the words, "She knows." Jake felt a chill run down his spine, but Eric dismissed it. "Just some old scribbles," he said. "Let's keep moving." They climbed to the second floor, where the asylum's infamous isolation ward was located. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the air grew heavy. Jake's flashlight flickered. That's when they heard it, a faint sound, like soft crying, echoing down the hall. Rachel froze. "Tell me you heard that," she whispered. Jake nodded, his heart pounding. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from one of the rooms. Against Rachel's protests, Jake and Eric moved toward the source, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They reached the door, its paint chipped and faded. The crying stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing. And then, the door creaked open. Inside was a small, empty room. But on the walls, written in what looked like blood, were the words, "Help me." Rachel gasped. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. Jake raised his camera to document the scene, but as he focused on the writing, the lens fogged up. He wiped it clean, only to see a figure standing behind them in the reflection. He spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. But the hallway was empty. The group decided to leave, but the asylum seemed to have other plans. The hallways twisted and shifted, leading them in circles. Doors that were once open slammed shut, and the whispers began. They were faint at first, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. But soon, they grew louder, forming words. They weren't random. They were names. Their names. Rachel broke down, tears streaming down her face. "We're not alone," she sobbed. Eric, trying to keep calm, led them toward what he thought was the exit. But as they turned a corner, they were met with a figure standing in the shadows. She was young, with long, dark hair and eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Her face was pale, her expression blank. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She just stared. Jake called out to her, his voice shaking. "Who are you?" The figure tilted her head, a slow, unnatural movement. And then, she whispered, "Eleanor." Rachel screamed, and the figure vanished. That's when the asylum came alive. Doors slammed, windows shattered, and the whispers turned into deafening screams. They ran, stumbling through the darkness, their flashlights flickering. Jake led the way, his heart racing as the building seemed to collapse around them. Finally, they burst through the front doors, collapsing on the ground outside. The asylum was silent once more, its shadow looming over them like a predator. They thought they were safe. But as they caught their breath, Jake noticed something. The camera, still clutched in his hand, was recording. He played back the footage, his hands trembling. There, in the reflection of a broken window, was Eleanor. She was watching them leave, her expression unreadable. They thought they had escaped. But the asylum, it never really lets you go. Shadows of Ravenwood Manor. Ravenwood Manor had stood atop Blackthorn Hill for over a century, its Gothic spires piercing the grey New England sky. Locals said the house was alive, that it fed on fear, growing stronger with every soul that crossed its threshold. For years, it had remained untouched, its windows like unblinking eyes watching the town below. That was until Emily Hart, a freelance journalist chasing her next big story, arrived in the small town of Blackthorn. Her interest in Ravenwood was piqued by the locals' refusal to speak of it, their nervous glances, and their hurried steps when the manor was mentioned. Emily wasn't superstitious. She believed every legend had a kernel of truth, a story waiting to be uncovered. What she didn't know was that some stories are better left untold. Armed with a camera, a notebook, and a flashlight, Emily made her way to the manor late one foggy afternoon. The iron gate, rusted and bent, creaked as she pushed it open. The air around the house was heavy, and the silence was almost oppressive. The once grand door groaned in protest as Emily stepped inside. The interior was a maze of decaying grandeur, ornate chandeliers covered in cobwebs, faded wallpaper peeling from the walls, and furniture draped in dusty sheets. It was as though time had stopped within these walls, leaving behind an eerie stillness. But it wasn't just the silence that unnerved her, it was the feeling of being watched. As she wandered through the manor, Emily's footsteps echoed in the vast, empty halls. She couldn't shake the sensation that she wasn't alone. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the broken windows, made her heart race. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, she found a leather-bound journal on a bedside table. The name scrawled on the first page sent a chill down her spine, Margaret Ravenwood. The journal detailed the days leading up to the family's disappearance. Margaret wrote about strange occurrences, doors slamming on their own, footsteps in the attic, and shadows that moved where no light existed. She wrote of a presence, something dark and insidious, that had taken hold of the house. Her last entry was a desperate plea, "To whoever reads this, leave this place. It will not let you go." Emily felt a chill run down her spine, but her curiosity overpowered her fear. She pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. She ventured into the attic, where Margaret claimed the presence was strongest. The attic was a cavernous space filled with forgotten relics, old trunks, broken toys, and portraits of the Ravenwood family. Emily's flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on a mirror leaning against the far wall. The mirror's surface was cracked, but it reflected something that made Emily freeze. In the dim light, she saw a shadowy figure standing behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Her pulse raced. She tried to convince herself it was a trick of the light, but deep down, she knew better. She wasn't alone. As Emily backed away, the mirror began to rattle violently. The air grew icy, and whispers filled the room, indistinct at first, but then louder, clearer. They were voices, pleading and angry, overlapping in a cacophony of despair. They were trapped. Their pain, their rage, it was all bound to this house. And now, it wanted her. Emily bolted from the attic, her flashlight flickering as she stumbled down the stairs. The house seemed to come alive around her. Doors slammed shut, walls groaned, and shadows darted across her path. She reached the front door, only to find it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into screams, and a deep, guttural voice echoed through the house, "You cannot leave. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pounded on the door. Desperation clawed at her, but the house, it wouldn't let her go. In a final act of defiance, Emily hurled her flashlight at a stained glass window, shattering it. She climbed through the jagged frame, cutting her hands and arms as she escaped into the cold night. As she stumbled down the hill, she looked back one last time. In the window of the attic, she saw them, shadowy figures watching her, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Emily left Blackthorn the next morning, vowing never to speak of Ravenwood Manor again. But the town? It still whispers of the house on the hill, waiting for its next visitor.